Mama. You're my favorite Mama. $600. I kind of wish my mom was on Twitter. I get everybody to wish her happy birthday that way. It's my mom's birthday about a week ago. JR raising with ace-king. 3 players call. 4 ways to the flop. We're not playing the 7-deuce game. At least I don't think we are. Stanley Choi with ace-6 on this ace-6 deuce board. Mike A with a pair of deuces. And JR with ace-king. This could get expensive. Stanley just calling on this dry board. Thank you, Ernesto. Mike A checks the 7-deuce. Really no reason for JR to take his foot off the pedal. Sky ace king. You want to get action from weaker aces. Little does he know that he is way behind. And I think when JR bets again, Stanley realizes, okay, this guy raised pre-flop. He's got a big ace. Do I want to raise here? Do I want to wait through the river? They are playing with a time clock. They have 30 seconds tacked on their hand, but they can use more time when they want it. This is kind of a really small raise. JR is going to quickly call.
There is a lot to talk about in this hand already. Exciting stuff. Let us begin with sizings, because I think it looks kind of obvious, but from an exploitative perspective on the flop, I really like JR to bet a little bit more. He bet really small, and maybe that's to keep bluffs in his range. You know, he wants to be able to bet with 2 back doors and stuff like that. If you're in practice not betting your 2 back doors against 3 opponents, which is probably okay not to do that often in most games because, you know, it's a lot of people to get through, you might want to bet bigger because all the weaker aces are going to have binary decisions, and you're going to get more money now in the pot, which seems pretty good before scary cards come.
And to be clear, 2 back doors, Grant's talking about hands like king, queen of diamonds.
Yeah, stuff like that.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting idea to bet more here. I don't know if all the aces have binary decisions. Like if Stanley has a 7 suited and we bet big with 2 guys behind him, I'm not sure if he's auto calling
Maybe.
or not. But in general, yes, if there's no one left to act and you've got a reasonable ace, you have to call kind of whatever the size is. And this is not a scary board.
Right. I mean, that's just small nitpick, but I think from an exploit perspective, that might have been nice. How about Stanley just calling with 2 players behind with top 2?
I am not a fan.
Okay.
I like the idea of raising here for a bunch of reasons. One is, why not knock out the equity behind us? Like, why just allow them in? Number one. Number two, for JR to decide to bet this board 4 ways, he almost always has a real hand, to your point earlier. Let's get some value out of that right now before scare cards comes, before, you know, like there's a lot of things that can come where we just can't keep getting value. This is a really good board for us, so we can almost always get value on the turn. But still, why do anything at all that's problematic except let's inflate this pot right now?
The reason Stanley may have done this is because it's hard not to look incredibly strong raising the under the gun opener who continues on this extremely dry board.
There's no question about that, but I think in practice, if you have a big hand, a big ace here, like JR does, he's just not folding to 1 raise.
Probably not, and you're more likely to get value now as Stanley than later, most likely.
It always looks stronger when you raise later. I mean, maybe, although we see on the turn.
Well, let's see about that raise later, okay? So I want to go back and talk about sizing again, though, for a second. Because JR now bets big. And I think I would have preferred him to choose opposite things. To bet bigger on the flop to get more from the aces, and to bet smaller on the turn now that he's been called when he bet into 4 players the first time that he bet. Because now hands like ace-10 have to seriously consider folding against this size.
They do.
Like, this looks incredibly strong when JR bets 4,200 into 5,400. I think a smaller size is in order here.
It's not a very wet board. I understand now there's a second diamond, and a hand like 4-5 of diamonds is now got the whole world it's drawing to, but very few hands are really improved by this 8. Ace-8 is, but guess what? We're losing to that anyway.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think a smaller bet is better, which I wouldn't have thought until you brought it up in our podcast.
Yeah. Another thing I brought up on our podcast is I don't actually like this raise by Stanley too much, let alone that the size is weird and small.
Yeah, I don't like the size.
I think not raising at all is probably okay. We have a player behind us. Sure. We want to knock out that equity, but JR bet big enough that equity is going to knock itself out most of the time. We don't have to do anything to accomplish that. And when we raise, it looks incredibly strong, and we might scare away hands like ace-king.
I mean, there's very few cards we're really afraid of on the river, right? Like an 8 is obviously an awful card for us. A big Broadway card is not great when we have JR betting.
A diamond
twice.
is not amazing.
A diamond is not amazing. But like mostly we're in good shape. And the cards that are really problematic, like a diamond, aren't folding to this raise anyway. Like all these hands have to call.
Right.
So like we're not really protecting ourselves. We do get to charge them a little bit more. I think I agree with you, and I think I like just a call here. So we want Stanley to do like the opposite of what he did as well, right?
So yeah, we want both players to kind of do opposites. Mike opposite sizing, Stanley opposite action.
Yeah.
And now it's on Mike, and he's getting an incredible price, but I kind of think it's a fold. Like what?
You mean JR, not Mike. Mike, of course, is folding.
Of course, Mike folds. Yes, that's what I meant. Not the 7 deuce guy.
Come
JR
on.
with the ace king. I think this might be a fold.
We are getting basically 4-1 to call, which is pretty good. We're losing to everything except the only bluffs that make sense are like backdoor diamonds that were straight draws almost always on the flop too. So like 4-5 of diamonds, 3-5 of diamonds,
3-4 diamonds,
3-4 of diamonds. 4-5 diamonds, as I said, did turn the whole wide world, which is cool. But there's only 3 combos of that. I guess maybe you could have king, queen of diamonds, have called 900 with 2 back doors and now turned a diamond draw. But like that's one more combo. There's just aren't very many combos of this stuff to be that afraid of. We're losing to all value. And he isn't raising an amount that has any fold equity.
No, this really feels like
very strong.
I understand why you would want to call with ace king.
You may just feel like your hand is too good and you just have to call for this amount.
But I kind of think it's a fold unless Stanley is the type of player who likes to do the free showdown play. So Stanley, which would mean Stanley has a hand like ace jack or ace 10 and doesn't really know where he is. So he wants to set the price for the river so that it's likely that JR won't bet the river now and it can just go check, check, and maybe he can win, which is, in my mind, not a good play. But if Stanley is capable of that play, that could be a reason to call with JR's hand.
But in general, like JR's kind of always losing here, right?
Yeah.
So I agree. This feels like against at least most of the population who's raising here, who isn't weird and spewy, you're always losing, and you can just fold.
Don't have enough outs against their range,
right? Like I would think I'm up against 6-6 or ace-8, like a lot of the time, right? Ace-8 feels like super obvious, and like we have 3 outs, we should just fold.
You should fold yourself in half and hurry up and get to this free roll. Survivor Pool NFL free roll on Nitro Betting. You have to do it by the end of the month. Sign up using the link in our pinned tweet and then send us your Nitro Betting ID number. This is a big deal. There's $1,100 of free money out there in this NFL Survivor Pool, but you have to use the link and you have to send us your ID number on Discord or Twitter.
It's free. It's great. You have to do it. Get in there.
I imagine JR will check. And if you're Stanley, it's just a matter of sizing. JR has the ace of diamonds. I think his hand is too good to turn into a bluff, but it'd be pretty awesome if he check raised. I can't imagine a scenario where he does. I just can't imagine JR doing it, but how cool would it be if he actually turned his hand into a bluff? So Stanley, after raising the turn, bets 9,000 on the river. JR getting about 3.5 to 1. Don't think he's going to fold this.
10 seconds. Bump it up. Make it 26,000.
Wow. JR is now check raise the river. I mean, effectively turning ace king into a bluff. I don't know if he sized it up enough, though. Yeah, Nick from Yuma saying that's not big enough. I mean, if JR goes like 45,000 there, or even all in, I don't know if he gets called. I think he's going to get called here, though. The problem is, I mean, if you're Stanley, you can't beat diamonds. You can't beat ace-jack, which is one of the hands JR could certainly have. Pretty cool play, nonetheless. Christian Wilson says the same thing in chat, saying, I love the play, just don't think it's a big enough check raise. Stanley using all of his time chips. Players have 30 seconds stacked on their hand, but they get a minute extra every time they use one of those time chips. But you can see they don't start with that many in the night. Wow.
Woo-wee, JR pulled it off.
Spicy.
That's a spicy meatball. All right. The first thing that we need to talk about, because JR's check is obvious, is whether or not Stanley should bet now that we're here and the jack of diamonds comes on the river. What do you think?
Well, that jack shouldn't matter too much. We assume ace-jack is mostly not even betting the turn, let alone calling the raise on the turn. I think so. Ace-jack shouldn't be a problem. Jack-jack isn't a problem. It's only diamonds. So in terms of us losing, I think we're usually still in good shape.
Well, I mean,
However,
diamonds could definitely be there.
But of course, it's also a scare card, so it's harder to get value from a hand just like we're up against. Like ace-king, as we see, doesn't really think it's okay to call, right?
Yeah.
So like, if we can't get called by ace-king, we should not bet. And I think clearly we cannot get called by ace-king. Ace-king refuses to call and would rather do any of the other two options, it seems.
And I think that's correct from JR because those bluff combos that we mentioned that could be there for Stanley on the turn, guess what? They all got there.
Every single one.
So you can't really call with ace-king profitably unless it's, of course, ace-king of diamonds. Then you're not going to call. You're going to raise, which is what JR is saying he has when he makes the raise.
Yeah, basically. That's right.
So, yeah, I think Stanley, when on the turn, makes this small raise, and it looks kind of like the free showdown play. Well, guess what? You're not giving yourself a free showdown when you bet, so that is kind of a weird combination of things to do if you actually were going for the free showdown play.
Which he, of course, wasn't, right? He's just betting for value. But from JR's point of view,
right.
It's like, oh, now I know for sure ace-king is no good when he bets again.
Yeah. And I also know he doesn't have the nuts because I block it with the ace of diamonds. This is the classic easiest play in the book. If you're willing to pull the trigger, I have the nut blocker. Taking an aggressive action on the river as a bluff is a cool play. The question is if you're against the right opponent and if your line makes sense.
Yeah, your opponent has to be willing to fold a strong hand because we strongly believe we're up against, at a minimum, 2 pair here. Right?
Yes, definitely. So we don't know anything about Stanley if he's the right opponent. But I do know that the line makes plenty of sense. I think you could argue that if JR made the nut flush that he should just lead the river because the diamond's a scare card.
You should sometimes lead and you should sometimes check raise,
yeah.
I think is really the
So
deal.
it's a perfectly fine representation is what that means to say.
Yes. I wonder in practice how often people really go for the check raise when the scare card comes. But, I mean, as long as the guy folds, who cares, right?
Yeah, and I think ultimately this is a cool play, and I think it's a good play.
Yeah, me too.
So I do like this play from JR. I know I poo-pooed some of his previous plays, although those were minor problems I had with them. I think this is a good play.
But what do you think Stanley should do now that this good play has happened? Stanley has aces up.
I think he should fold.
Yeah,
I think his distribution demands that he folds. I think he has... I don't think there's any relevant blockers that he could have here to make certain blockers better than others. I don't think a set of aces is in play for JR, so it doesn't matter that he has an ace here, for example.
JR is repping a flush really clearly.
Yeah, the nut flush mostly.
And we can never have one diamond in our hand as Stanley. I don't think it's really possible.
Except for a set of deuces with a diamond.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess that's true. I guess that's the way we could have a blocker.
Right, but a set of deuces is better by rank than this hand anyway,
Yes.
as is a set of sixes, or maybe the rare set of eights, of course, ace-8, and all of those diamond combos that we mentioned before. I think we should only call with some of those hands that I just mentioned, but this is below the threshold, and I think the fold is correct.
And if we look at, as Grant was saying, distribution, hands that are worse than ours that we might bet on the river are only 2 pair combos, and it's just ace deuce and 6-8 are the only ones even possible. Now, we really might bet those, but that's it.
Yep.
Everything else that you just mentioned is better than our hand anyway. I think I agree. We absolutely have to fold. Stanley agrees too, to JR's happiness and his own personal chagrin. That's Stanley's chagrin. Stanley may have been feeling the chagrin of it all. But what do you guys think about all these plays? So we had a lot of little nitpicky thoughts on every street and almost every decision all the players had. But there's the really big showy stuff, which may be the most interesting. Like, do you ultimately think Stanley should be betting the river? Do you ultimately think this is a good play by JR? I know it worked, but is it a good play? Is it profitable long-term to make this play against a player like Stanley? Do you think Stanley should actually find a fold against a player like JR? Weigh in, please.
Weigh in and check out our Discord. There's a link in the description. We can chat there. It's fun. See you there.